1754 BC, Babylon. A surgeon stands over a wealthy merchant, bronze lancet in hand. The merchant's eye is clouded with cataracts. He cannot see his own children. The surgeon has done this procedure before. He has succeeded before. But he knows what happens if he fails. If this man dies on his table, the state will cut off both of the surgeon's hands. Not a fine. Not imprisonment. His hands, his career, his life, gone. The surgeon's hand trembles. This is not medicine. This is calculated terror. And it works. Welcome to the world Hammurabi built. A world where your doctor operated in fear. Where your builder constructed your house knowing his son's life depended on its stability. Where a merchant's debt could kill your children. Where the law was not a shield, it was a weapon. And every person in Babylon lived under its edge. This is not a story about justice. This is a story about control, about how one king transformed chaos into order not through mercy, not through persuasion, but through a system of punishment so brutal, so public, so inescapable that an entire civilization bent itself around the fear of it. Hammurabi did not invent fairness. He invented a technology of fear that worked better than any army. And it would echo through human civilization for the next 4,000 years. The code itself was a monument, yes, but it was also a threat. 8 feet of polished black stone, covered in 282 laws, placed in the Temple of Marduk, where anyone could see it. The stone was diorite, one of the hardest rocks known to ancient craftsmen, imported from quarries near the Persian Gulf, possibly from Magan, modern Oman. Carving it required bronze chisels and extraordinary skill. The work likely took months, perhaps years. Every character had to be perfect. There was no room for error. A mistake meant starting over with a new block of stone worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The stele was not unique. Hammurabi had copies made and distributed to major cities across his empire. Most have been lost, but fragments have been found in Susa, in Sippar, in Ur. This was not just law, this was propaganda. The code was meant to be seen, to be known, to be feared in every corner of Babylonia. Could they read it? Most could not. Literacy was rare, confined mostly to scribes, priests, and the merchant class. But they knew it was there. They knew what it said, because the punishments were public. The executions were public. The mutilations were public. You did not need to read cuneiform to understand that the man screaming in the marketplace, his hands being severed at the wrists, had failed as a doctor. You did not need literacy to know that the builder whose house collapsed, whose son was dragged to the executioner because the homeowner's son had died in the rubble, had cut corners on construction. Hammurabi called it justice. He called himself the shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods to protect the weak from the strong. The prologue to his code is full of this language: righteousness, fairness, the destruction of the wicked. But read the laws themselves, and a different picture emerges. This was not protection. This was a system of control so precise, so comprehensive, so terrifying in its consistency that it made rebellion unthinkable and crime unsustainable. Every transaction was regulated. Every dispute had a prescribed outcome. Every failure had a price, and that price was almost always paid in flesh. The code was written in Akkadian, the diplomatic and commercial language of the ancient Near East, using cuneiform script. Learning to read and write cuneiform took years. A scribe began training as a child, perhaps as young as 7, and spent a decade or more in a scribal school, and Aduba, the tablet house. Students practiced writing on damp clay tablets, copying texts over and over until the signs were perfect. They memorized thousands of cuneiform characters, learned mathematics, accounting, law, literature. Only a tiny fraction of the population could read the code. But literacy was power. Scribes controlled access to information, to contracts, to the law itself. Hammurabi knew this. By making the law written, he made it controlled. You could not appeal to tradition if the tradition was written down, and you could not read it. You could not argue about what the law said if only scribes could decipher it. The code created a class of literate intermediaries who stood between the people and the law, interpreting it, applying it, and profiting from their monopoly on knowledge. Before Hammurabi, Mesopotamia was drowning in chaos. Not the romantic chaos of freedom, but the grinding, lethal chaos of a society where power was everything and law was whatever the strong said it was. Debt spirals destroyed families. A farmer who borrowed seed grain and lost his crop to flood did not just lose his harvest. He lost his children. Creditors could seize them, work them, beat them, sell them, and there was no mechanism to stop it. No appeal, no recourse. If you were weak, you were prey. Disputes over land and water ended in blood feuds that lasted generations. A broken irrigation dike was not a civil matter. It was a death sentence. If your dike broke and flooded your neighbor's field, destroying his crop, the neighbor did not take you to court. He killed you, or he killed your sons. And then your family killed his sons, and the cycle continued until one family was extinct or both were too broken to fight. There was no authority to stop it, no judge to adjudicate, no code to reference. Violence was the only language anyone understood. Cities competed and collapsed in constant warfare. Uruk, Lagash, these were not peaceful trading partners. They were armed camps, each ruled by kings who claimed divine mandate but possessed only as much power as their armies could project. Alliances formed and shattered within a single generation. Treaties were signed with elaborate ceremonies, involving oaths before the gods, sacrifices, hostages exchanged. And then they were broken the moment one side saw advantage. Trust was impossible. Cooperation was suicidal. And ordinary people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, lived in permanent uncertainty. You could not plan beyond the next harvest because you did not know if your city would still exist. You could not invest in a workshop because raiders might burn it next month. You could not save wealth because creditors could seize it on a whim. You could not trust that the rules today would be the rules tomorrow. Commerce ground to a halt. Why trade with someone who might rob you with impunity? Why lend money when there was no way to enforce repayment? Why build anything when it could be destroyed and you would have no recourse? This was the world Hammurabi inherited, and he understood something fundamental. You cannot build an empire on chaos. You cannot collect taxes from people who do not know if they will live to harvest their crops. You cannot sustain trade when merchants are robbed on roads with no mechanism for justice. You cannot maintain an army when soldiers' families can be enslaved for debt while they are fighting. You need predictability. You need people to believe that if they follow certain rules, certain outcomes will follow. You need them to plan, to invest, to trust, at least minimally, in the future. But how do you create predictability in a world where violence is the only currency? You cannot appeal to mercy. Mercy is weakness. You cannot appeal to shared values. There are no shared values across a fractured empire of conquered cities. You cannot appeal to tradition. Every city has different traditions. The only thing everyone understands is power. So you use power, but you use it systematically. You replace the chaos of individual brutality with the order of state brutality. You create a system of violence so overwhelming, so certain, so inescapable that it becomes predictable itself, and you make sure everyone knows the rules. The Code was Hammurabi's answer. 282 laws, each one a conditional threat. If you do this, this will happen to you. Not maybe, not depending on who you know or how much you can pay. This will happen. The brilliance was not in the harshness of the punishments, and though they were harsh, the brilliance was in the certainty. A thief knew exactly what awaited him. A negligent builder knew exactly what his failure would cost. A lying witness knew that he would suffer the same fate he had tried to impose on the accused. There was no ambiguity, no negotiation, no escape. This is what made the system work, not justice, fear. But fear that was calculable. You could avoid punishment by following the rules. The rules were written down. They were public. They were consistent. And that consistency made them a tool of control far more powerful than random violence could ever be. Think about what this means in practice. A builder working on a house for a wealthy merchant knows that if the house collapses and kills the merchant, the builder will be executed. If it kills the merchant's son, the builder's son will be executed. So the builder does not cut corners. He does not use inferior materials. He does not rush the work. Not because he cares about the merchant, not because he believes in quality craftsmanship, because his son's life depends on that house standing. Every brick he lays with his child's face in his mind. The state does not need an inspector on site. The builder inspects himself. The fear is internalized. The control is automatic. A doctor treating a patient knows that if the patient dies, the doctor loses his hands. So the doctor does not take risks. He does not experiment. He does not attempt procedures he is not absolutely certain will succeed. He turns away difficult cases. He refuses to operate on patients who might not survive. This means some people die who might have been saved. But it also means doctors are extraordinarily careful with the patients they do accept. The state does not need a medical board. The doctor regulates himself through terror. This is the technology Hammurabi perfected, not surveillance, self-surveillance, not enforcement, self-enforcement. You create punishments so severe that people police themselves. You make the consequences so personal, so immediate, so unavoidable that the fear becomes part of how people think. They do not rebel because they do not even consider rebellion. The punishment is too certain. The cost is too high. And so they obey. Not because they agree with the law, not because they think it is just, because the alternative is unthinkable. The geography shaped everything, and it was merciless. Mesopotamia was a floodplain, flat and fertile, but the rivers that gave life also brought death. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded without warning. A good flood deposited rich silt on the fields. A bad flood destroyed everything: crops, canals, homes, lives. Unlike the Nile, which flooded predictably every year on schedule, the Mesopotamian rivers were violent and capricious. You could lose everything in a single night. Drought was equally catastrophic. When the rivers ran low, Fields turned to cracked earth. Crops withered. Famine followed. Survival required cooperation on a scale that was unnatural. A single farmer could not control water. A single village could not maintain the canal system. You needed organization. You needed labor mobilization. You needed someone with the power to say, "You will dig here. You will maintain this section, and if you fail, this is what happens to you." Without that power, the system collapsed. Fields dried up, cities starved, civilization ended. This environmental reality created the need for a strong state. But a strong state creates its own problems. How do you prevent the strong from devouring the weak? How do you stop officials from taking bribes? How do you ensure that judges do not favor the rich? Hammurabi's answer was brutal simplicity. You make the penalty so severe that corruption becomes suicide. You make the rules so clear that favoritism becomes impossible to hide. You create a system where everyone, from slave to noble, knows exactly what happens when the law is broken. And then you enforce it without mercy. The economy was built on debt, and debt was a weapon. But it was also sophisticated in ways that would not be seen again for centuries. Babylon had a class of professional traders called Tomkarum, commercial agents who operated on credit advanced by wealthy merchant houses. These traders traveled caravan routes from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean, buying tin, copper, lapis lazuli, timber, and reselling it in Babylonian markets. The code regulated every aspect of these transactions. Law 102. If a merchant gives silver to a trading agent for investment and the agent suffers a loss on the journey, he must repay the principal. Law 103. If the agent is robbed by enemy forces while traveling, he swears an oath to the gods and is released from obligation. The merchant absorbs the loss. This created a system where risk was allocated fairly. Merchants could not blame agents for circumstances beyond their control, but agents could not simply claim losses and keep the silver. Temples functioned as banks. They accepted deposits. They made loans. They held reserves in grain and silver. Priests kept meticulous records on clay tablets, tracking every transaction. Thousands of these tablets have been found, preserved in the ruins of temple archives. They show an economy far more complex than most people realize. There were futures contracts for grain. There were partnerships where profits were split according to capital invested. There were what we would now call limited liability arrangements, where investors could lose only what they put in, not everything they owned. Merchants advanced goods to traders. Landlords lent seed to farmers. All of this required trust, or at least the appearance of trust. But what happens when a borrower cannot repay? In the chaos before Hammurabi, the answer was simple. The creditor took everything: your land, your animals, your children, your wife, you. Entire families disappeared into bondage over debts they could never repay. The system was unsustainable. It created a permanent underclass of the indebted, people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from overthrowing the order. Hammurabi's code did not eliminate debt. It regulated it. Interest rates were capped, 33% for grain, 20% for silver. High by modern standards, but lower than what predatory lenders charged when no one was watching. Debt bondage was limited to 3 years. After that, you were free, whether you had repaid or not. If a creditor seized your grain without permission, he forfeited the entire debt. If a creditor caused the death of your son through abuse, his son was executed. These were not acts of mercy, they were acts of control. Hammurabi understood that debt slavery, if left unchecked, would destroy the tax base. Dead peasants pay no taxes. Families sold into permanent bondage produce no surplus. The code limited exploitation, not because exploitation was wrong, but because uncontrolled exploitation was economically inefficient and politically destabilizing. The strong were allowed to profit, but they were not allowed to devour the system itself. We still live in this system. We call it bankruptcy law. We call it debt forgiveness. We call it consumer protection. But the logic is identical. Unchecked debt destroys the economy. So the state intervenes, not to save debtors, but to save the system. Student loan forgiveness, mortgage relief, credit card regulation, these are not humanitarian gestures. They are economic stabilizers. Hammurabi understood this 4,000 years ago. The state protects the weak only when the weak are necessary to the functioning of the strong. The social structure was not a hierarchy. It was a caste system enforced through mutilation. At the top were the aulim, free men of property. Below them were the mushkinum, semi-free dependents who worked royal land or served in the administration. At the bottom were slaves. The code did not pretend these groups were equal. It made inequality explicit, brutal, and legal. If you destroyed a free man's eye, your eye was destroyed. If you destroyed a mushkinum's eye, you paid a fine. If you destroyed a slave's eye, you paid the owner half the slave's value. The same injury, 3 different punishments based entirely on status. This was not an accident. This was the point. The code told you, in writing, that your life was worth less if you were born into the wrong class, and it backed that message with state violence. A slave who struck a free man could have his ear cut off. A son who struck his father could have his hand cut off. The code did not just punish crimes, it punished violations of hierarchy. The worst crime was not murder, it was insubordination, because insubordination threatened the system itself. If slaves could strike masters, if sons could strike fathers, if the weak could challenge the strong, the entire structure collapsed. The code existed to prevent that collapse, not through persuasion, through terror. Women existed in a legal gray zone between person and property. A woman could own things. She could inherit from her father. She could testify in court. But her legal identity was always tied to a man, her father, her husband, her son. Her dowry was hers, but her husband controlled it. If she died without children, it went back to her father's family. If she had children, it went to them. A widow with children had some security. A widow without children had almost none. But some women operated businesses. Tavern keepers, for example, were almost always women. Beer was the staple drink of Mesopotamia, consumed daily by everyone from slaves to nobles. Taverns were social centers, places where men gathered to drink, gossip, gamble, and conduct business. And they were dangerous. Law 108. If a tavern keeper does not accept grain as payment, but demands silver and charges more than the value of the beer, she is thrown into the water. Law 109. If criminals meet in a tavern and the tavern keeper does not arrest them and bring them to the palace, the tavern keeper is executed. Think about that. A woman running a small business in Babylon had to police her own customers. If rebels or thieves met in her establishment and she did not turn them in, she died. This was not about justice. This was about turning every citizen into an informant. The state could not monitor every conversation in every tavern, but it could make tavern keepers so afraid of being associated with criminals that they would betray their own customers to save themselves. Priestesses faced even stranger restrictions. Law 110. If a Naditu priestess, a woman dedicated to a god and forbidden to bear children, opens a tavern or enters a tavern for a drink, she is burned alive. Not drowned, burned. The code does not explain why. Perhaps taverns were seen as places of disorder, incompatible with religious purity. Perhaps the real reason was economic. Naditu priestesses often came from wealthy families and controlled significant property. If they engaged in commerce or drank in public, they might gain too much independence, too much power. Better to confine them to temples where their wealth could be controlled. Marriage was a contract, and divorce was possible, but the terms were gendered and brutal. A man could divorce his wife by returning her dowry and providing support if they had children. A woman could divorce her husband only if she could prove he had mistreated or abandoned her. If she could not prove it and left anyway, she could be drowned. If a woman was accused of adultery and could not prove her innocence, she underwent trial by ordeal, thrown into the river. If she drowned, she was guilty. If she survived, she was innocent. The river decided, the gods decided, not evidence, not witnesses, water. Understand what this actually meant. A woman is accused of adultery. Perhaps she is guilty. Perhaps her husband is paranoid. Perhaps a neighbor wants her property. Perhaps a creditor wants to eliminate her claim. The accusation is made. She denies it. There are no witnesses, no proof. So the court orders the ordeal. She is taken to the river, the Euphrates, swift current, deep water. Her hands are bound, not loosely, tightly, so she cannot swim. She is thrown in. If she drowns, her body is pulled from the water and buried without ceremony. The accusation is confirmed. She was an adulteress. Her property goes to her accuser or the state. If she somehow survives, if she manages to surface despite bound hands, despite the current, despite the panic, she is declared innocent. And she is free to return to her life, if she still has one. But consider the probabilities. How many women accused of adultery survived this ordeal? How many could swim well enough to surface with bound hands? How many had the strength to fight the current? The ordeal was not a test. It was an execution with a thin veneer of divine judgment. The river always chose guilt. The state knew this. The judges knew this. Everyone knew this. This was not superstition. This was a mechanism for legal murder. A woman you wanted gone, for any reason, could be disposed of through a simple accusation. And it was all legal. Sanctioned by the code. Approved by the gods. No one could question it, because to question the ordeal was to question Shamash, the god of justice. And that was heresy. This is the reality of law as control. The code gave men a tool to destroy women and called it justice. And women lived with that knowledge every day. One accusation, one trip to the river, and your life was over. We pretend we have moved beyond this. But have we? When a woman accuses a powerful man today, what happens? She is subjected to trial by media, trial by public opinion. Her past is scrutinized. Her motives are questioned. If she survives the process, perhaps she gets justice. If she does not, her life is destroyed and the accusation is forgotten. The river has been replaced by the internet. The mechanism endures. Professional failure was punished with mutilation. A doctor who operated on a free man and the patient died had both hands cut off. Not one, both. His career ended in a marketplace, in front of a crowd, with a bronze blade and a chopping block. This was not malpractice insurance. This was state terror directed at professionals. And it worked. Doctors refused difficult cases. They refused to operate unless they were absolutely certain of success. Better to let a patient die untreated than to risk your hands on a surgery that might fail. Builders face something worse. If you built a house and it collapsed, killing the homeowner, you were executed. If it killed the homeowner's son, your son was executed. Read that again. Your son, not you. Your child paid for your failure with his life. This is collective punishment. This is the principle of substitutionary death applied to construction. A builder with children worked in permanent existential dread. Every beam he placed, every wall he erected, every foundation he dug, he knew that if any of it failed, if the house fell and someone died, his son would be dragged to the executioner, not as punishment for what the son had done. The son had done nothing, as punishment for what the father had failed to do. Imagine living with that knowledge. You are a builder in Babylon. You have a 10-year-old son. You are commissioned to build a house for a merchant. The merchant is impatient. He wants it done quickly. He offers you extra silver to finish early. You know you could cut corners. Use less wood in the roof beams. Dilute the mud plaster. Skip a layer of brick in the foundation. The house would stand. Probably. For a while. And you would collect your payment and move on to the next job. But what if the house falls? What if, 5 years from now, the merchant's grandson is playing in the courtyard and the roof collapses? The boy dies, and the state comes for your son. Your son, who is now 15, who has never been inside that house, who has no idea his father cut corners, who is innocent in every conceivable sense of the word, except that he is your son. And that is enough. So you do not cut corners. You use the best materials you can afford. You take your time. You triple-check every measurement. You pray to Shamash that the house will stand forever. Not because you are a perfectionist. Not because you take pride in your work. Because your son's life depends on it. The state does not need building inspectors. The builder inspects himself with the most powerful motivation imaginable, the survival of his child. This is how the code controlled behavior at a level that surveillance never could. It made you responsible not just for your own actions, but for their consequences years into the future. And it made you responsible through the people you loved. Your failure did not just hurt you, it destroyed your family. This was not justice. This was hostage-taking encoded into law. And it worked because the threat was absolutely credible. The state would kill your child. You knew this. Everyone knew this, because they had seen it happen. Today, we do not execute builders' children. We sue them. We revoke their licenses. We bankrupt them. We destroy their careers. The mechanism is different. The principle is the same. If you fail, you lose what matters to you. We have just made the loss financial and professional instead of physical. We call it accountability. Hammurabi called it justice. Both are euphemisms for the same thing, state-enforced consequences designed to make people afraid to fail. Hammurabi was not a philosopher. He was a ruler who understood power. He came to power in a fragmented Mesopotamia where city-states constantly warred with each other. Babylon was not the strongest, but Hammurabi was patient. He made alliances. He waited. And when the moment came, he struck. He conquered Larsa, absorbed Eshnunna, crushed Mari. Within 15 years, he controlled most of southern Mesopotamia. But conquest was easy. Control was hard. How do you govern an empire of cities that hate each other? Cities with different gods, different customs, different languages. You cannot garrison every street. You cannot put a soldier in every home. You need the people to govern themselves. You need them to internalize control. And the way you do that is through law. Not law as justice. Law as a machine that runs on fear. The code was promulgated near the end of his reign. It was not the beginning of his rule. It was the capstone. After the conquests, after the wars, after the empire was built, he created the tool that would hold it together after he died. And it worked. Long after Hammurabi's death, long after Babylon fell and rose and fell again, the code endured. Because it was not about Hammurabi. It was about the technology of control he had perfected. Theft was punished by death. Not just execution, public execution. If you stole an ox, you paid 30 tasmes its value. If you could not pay, you were killed in the marketplace where everyone could watch. If you stole during a fire, taking advantage of chaos to loot, you were thrown into the fire. If you broke into a house, you were executed and buried in the hole you had made. The symbolism was deliberate. The punishment mirrored the crime, but magnified. The state did not just punish theft, it made theft a spectacle, a warning, a lesson written in blood. Commerce depended on oaths, and oaths depended on fear of the gods. When a trader claimed he had been robbed on the road, he swore an oath before Shamash, the sun god. He placed his hand on a sacred object and called the gods to witness his truthfulness. If he lied, the gods would punish him. Illness, crop failure, the death of his children. Divine retribution was not metaphor. It was expected. And that expectation made oaths work. This was social control through supernatural terror. The state could not monitor every transaction. It could not investigate every claim. But it did not need to. The gods were watching. And everyone believed it. A merchant who swore falsely might escape human punishment, but he would not escape divine punishment. And that belief, multiplied across an entire society, created a system of self-regulation far more effective than any police force could have been. Slavery was total. A slave who ran away could be hunted. If you harbored a runaway slave, you were executed. If you helped a slave escape, you were executed. The code made every citizen an enforcer. Your neighbor might be a fugitive slave. If you hid him, fed him, helped him, you died. This turned the entire population into slave catchers. Trust became impossible. Solidarity became suicidal. The system enforced itself through collective paranoia. A father could disinherit his son, but only with a judge's approval. The first offense was forgiven. The second was final. This created a system of paternal terror. A son who angered his father risked losing everything, not through violence, through law. The state gave fathers the power to destroy their sons economically, and fathers used that power to enforce obedience. The family was not a refuge. It was another site of control. Adoption was common, and the code regulated it extensively. Law 185. If a man adopts a child and raises him as his son, that child cannot be reclaimed by his birth parents. Law 186. If a man adopts a child, but then the child seeks his birth parents, he can return to them, but he loses all claim to the adoptive father's property. Law 192. If an adopted son says to his adoptive father, "You are not my father," his tongue is cut out. Think about the brutality of that. A child, adopted and raised, has a dispute with his adoptive father. Perhaps the father is abusive. Perhaps the relationship has broken down. The child, in anger or desperation, denies the adoption, and the state cuts out his tongue. Not expelled from the family, not disinherited, mutilated. This was not about protecting children. This was about protecting the institution of adoption, ensuring that wealthy families could acquire heirs without fear that those heirs would reject them. Wet nurses also fell under the Code's regulation, Law 194. If a man gives his son to a wet nurse, and the son dies in the care of the wet nurse, and the wet nurse secretly substitutes another child without telling the parents, her breasts are cut off. This law reveals something about Babylonian society that is rarely discussed. Infant mortality was high. Children died, and when they did, there was apparently a black market in replacement children. A wet nurse whose charge died might replace the child with another, hoping the parents would not notice. The Code made this practice punishable by mutilation, not death. Mutilation. The wet nurse would live, but she would never nurse again. Her livelihood, her identity, her capacity to earn, destroyed. The laws concerning assault and personal injury are among the most famous in the Code, largely because of the principle of lex talionis. If a man destroyed another man's eye, his eye was destroyed. If a man broke another man's bone, his bone was broken. If a man knocked out another man's tooth, his tooth was knocked out. This is the origin of the phrase, an eye for an eye. But the principle applied only to free men of equal status. If a free man destroyed the eye of a mushkenom, he paid a fine. If a free man destroyed the eye of a slave, he paid the slave's owner half the slave's value. The Code did not treat all people equally. Punishment depended on status. A rich man who injured a poor man paid less than if he had injured another rich man. This inequality was embedded in the structure of the law. But even within this unequal system, the Code imposed limits. A master could not kill a slave without reason. A creditor could not seize a debtor's wife or children and work them to death. A builder could not construct a house so poorly that it collapsed and killed the occupants without facing execution himself. The Code acknowledged that power had boundaries, and that those who exceeded those boundaries would be punished. This was not equality, but it was a form of accountability that had not always existed in earlier societies, where the powerful could act with impunity. The Code also addressed unintentional harm. If a man struck a pregnant woman during a fight and she miscarried, he was required to pay a fine. If the woman died, the man's daughter was executed. This law reflects the principle of collective family responsibility. If you caused harm, your family suffered. It also reflects the value placed on reproduction. A miscarriage was a loss, but it was a financial loss, compensated with money. A death was a greater loss, compensated with a life. The logic was brutal, but it was consistent. The Code also regulated wages, but not to protect workers, to control them, to make labor predictable and therefore exploitable. A hired laborer was entitled to a specific daily wage measured in grain or silver. The amount varied depending on the season and the type of work. Harvest laborers earned more than off-season laborers. Skilled workers earned more than unskilled workers. But the code did not leave wages to negotiation. It set them by law. This was not generosity. This was standardization. Workers could not demand more. Employers could not pay less. The system locked everyone in place. An eye for an eye. Everyone knows the phrase. Few know what it actually meant. If you destroyed a free man's eye, your eye was destroyed. If you destroyed a mushkinim's eye, you paid silver. If you destroyed a slave's eye, you paid the owner half the slave's value. Same injury, 3 different punishments. The code did not pretend to offer justice. It offered hierarchy made flesh. And it went further. If you struck your father, your hand was cut off. If a slave struck a free man, his ear was cut off. The code did not just punish violence, it punished violations of the social order. The worst crime was not murder, it was insubordination. Hitting someone above you in the hierarchy was worse than killing someone below you. This was a legal system designed to make inequality permanent, inescapable, and enforced by the state's capacity for mutilation. Wages were fixed by law, not negotiable. A harvest laborer earned 8 grains of silver per day during peak season, 6 during off-season. This was not about fairness, it was about control. Workers could not bargain. Employers could not compete. The state set the price of labor and enforced it. This prevented labor unrest, prevented wage inflation, and kept the economy predictable. Predictability was power. The courts were not about finding truth. They were about finding someone to punish. Judges were royal appointees, trained in the code, answerable to the king. If they made a mistake, if they reversed a verdict without cause, they were fined 12 times the disputed amount and removed from office. This made judges cautious. It also made them ruthless. Better to execute an innocent man than to risk being wrong twice. Witnesses were everything. The code is obsessed with witnesses. Law 3. If a man comes forward in a case to bear witness and then cannot prove the statement he has made, if that case involves loss of life, that man shall be put to death. Law 9. If a man has lost property and finds his lost property in another man's possession, and the holder says, "A merchant sold it to me. I bought it in the presence of witnesses," and the original owner says, "I will bring witnesses who know my lost property," then both parties must produce their witnesses before the gods. If the seller's witnesses prove the sale was legitimate, the buyer keeps the property and the original owner gets nothing. But if the buyer cannot produce witnesses, he is a thief and is executed. Think about what this means in practice. Every transaction required witnesses. When you bought a field, you needed witnesses. When you borrowed silver, you needed witnesses. When you settled a dispute, you needed witnesses. And not just any witnesses. The code specified that witnesses had to swear oaths before the gods in temples. This created an entire bureaucracy of transaction witnessing. Professional witnesses existed, men whose job was to observe deals and testify to them later for a fee. But this system was also weaponizable. If you wanted to destroy someone, you found witnesses willing to lie. And if you were wealthy enough, you could always find witnesses. The code tried to prevent this through brutal penalties for perjury. Witnesses had to testify under oath, invoking the gods. If you lied and were caught, you faced the same punishment you had tried to impose on the accused. Testified falsely in a capital case, you were executed. Testified falsely in a property dispute, you paid the fine. This made perjury suicidal. It also made testimony reliable, not because people were honest, but because lying was too dangerous. The system did not seek justice. It sought closure. A crime had been committed. Someone had to pay. The code specified who and how much. The trial was just a formality to confirm what the law had already decided. The code survived because it worked, not because it was just, because it was effective. After Hammurabi died, his empire collapsed. Babylon was sacked. The dynasty ended. But the code endured. Scribes copied it. Rulers referenced it. Later empires, Assyrian, Persian, Neo-Babylonian, studied it and adapted it. Not because they admired Hammurabi's morality, because they recognized the technology he had built. A system of control that ran on fear and predictability. The Hebrews exiled to Babylon in the 6th century BC encountered the code and brought some of its concepts back to their own law. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That phrase appears in Exodus, nearly identical to Hammurabi's formulation. The Greeks and Romans knew of Mesopotamian legal traditions, filtered through centuries of cultural transmission. The idea that laws should be written and public, that rulers should be bound by them, that punishment should be proportional. These concepts echo from Hammurabi through history. But here is the bridge to today. Hammurabi did not invent fairness. He invented something more powerful, the idea that the state's violence could be made predictable, that fear, if systematized, could replace constant warfare, that people would obey not because they believed in the system, but because they knew exactly what would happen if they did not. We live in that world. We call it civilization. We call it the rule of law. But strip away the language and the institutions, and you find the same mechanism: obey, or the state will hurt you. We have softened the punishments. We have expanded rights. We have created appeals and due process. But the core principle remains. The law is not a shield. It is a weapon the state wields to ensure compliance. And we accept this because the alternative, chaos, blood feuds, warlords, is worse. Hammurabi understood something we like to forget. Civilization is not built on consent. It is built on the threat of violence, organized, legalized, and made so predictable that most people never have to experience it directly. They obey because they know the consequences. And that knowledge, that fear, creates the order we call peace. In 1901, French archaeologists found the stele in Susa, Iran. It had been looted from Babylon 1,500 years after Hammurabi's death, carried away by the Elamites around 1200 BC when they sacked the city. But the Elamites did something strange. They began erasing portions of the text. 7 columns of laws, roughly 35 laws, were carefully chiseled away, leaving smooth blank spaces on the stone. Why? Scholars debated this for decades. The most likely answer: they intended to replace Hammurabi's name with their own king's name to claim the code as Elamite rather than Babylonian. But they never finished. Perhaps the scribe died. Perhaps the project was abandoned. Perhaps the Elamites realized that the code's power came not from whose name was on it, but from the system it described. Whatever the reason, the stele remained incomplete, a monument to one empire vandalized by another, preserved by accident in Susa for 3,000 years. When the French archaeologists brought it to Paris and scholars deciphered it, they realized what they were looking at. Not a relic, but a blueprint. A technology of control that had worked for millennia. The missing laws were eventually reconstructed from other copies found on clay tablets in Babylonian libraries. Scribes had made duplicates. The system had redundancy. Babylon is gone. The city Hammurabi built is ruins. The temples have collapsed. The canals are filled with sand. The empire ended. But the idea survived. The idea that you can control people not through constant violence, but through the threat of violence, made predictable and inescapable. That fear, if formalized, becomes stronger than force. We dress it up now. We call it justice. We call it the social contract. We pretend that we consent to be governed, that we choose to obey the law. But strip away the language, and you find the same mechanism Hammurabi used: obey or be punished. The punishments are different. We do not cut off hands. We do not execute builders. We do not throw women into rivers. But the principle remains. The state retains a monopoly on violence, and it uses that monopoly to ensure compliance. Hammurabi's code was not the beginning of civilization. Civilizations existed long before him, but it was one of the first systematic attempts to codify the violence that makes civilization possible, to write down the rules of coercion, to make the threat explicit, public, and unavoidable. And in doing so, it revealed something we prefer not to see: that order is not natural. It is imposed. That peace is not the absence of violence. It is violence organized and administered by the state, made so routine that we no longer notice it. This is Hammurabi's legacy. Not justice, control, not fairness. Predictability, not compassion. Fear refined into a tool that could govern millions. The code was brutal, but it worked. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson of all. Civilization does not begin with enlightenment. It begins with someone powerful enough to say, "These are the rules, and if you break them, this is what happens to you." And it continues because most people, most of the time, would rather obey than find out if the threat is real. The stele sits in the Louvre today. Tourists walk past it. They take photos. They do not read the laws. They do not understand what they are looking at. A monument to fear. A testament to the technology of control. A reminder that the order we live in was not built on consent or reason or shared values. It was built on the threat of pain, made systematic, made legal, and made so consistent that eventually people stopped needing to be threatened. They governed themselves because they remembered what happened to those who did not. Hammurabi did not create justice. He created a machine that ran on fear and called it law. And we have been living in the world that machine built ever since.